good. Thanks so much for doing this. We try to get people to make more discussion. Yeah, you can do that. I'll also go.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. How is everyone feeling after that large lunch? Do you need an icebreaker or are you okay? Okay, so the first icebreaker is that everybody has to come down to the front. So jump up, stretch your legs, come down and join everyone at the front. Come on. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, if you'd come and take a seat down the front. I think the intent of these sessions is to be a bit more workshop and a bit more informal, so it'd be lovely if anyone sitting up the back would come down and join us at the front. So all of our speakers have arrived, so we might get started. Nisam Bulavanaka and good afternoon everyone. Welcome to panel 7A on the last afternoon of the last day of the 2019 Pacific Update. I hope you've all had a wonderful time. And I believe today has been all focused around the very important and interesting topic of Pacific labour mobility. So Solly is my name. I'm the CEO of the Australia Pacific Training Coalition. So we're a centre of training excellence and collaboration here in the Pacific, working with a wide range of partners across the whole region to support the Pacific Skills Agenda. So for this reason, I was only too happy when Stephen wrote to me to see if I would moderate this afternoon's panel on this very important issue of skills. And I know you've had a lot of discussions already. I think often when we think about labour mobility and skills, we talk about the negative correlations and the issues of brain drain and skills drain, as is understandable. But not as often do we actually talk about or work towards better articulating and understanding all of the direct and indirect ways that labour mobility might actually be able to result in a net skill gain for the region. So today we have a wonderful lineup of speakers to discuss this important issue. And I'd like to just introduce all of them to you first. So they're sitting down the front so they can see each other's presentations as well, but then they'll come up the front to do the Q&A. So our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Richard Curtin, Research Fellow at Dev Policy ANU, who focuses on labour mobility, Pacific labour mobility. I'm sure many of you know Richard and know that he's a leading expert on all things skills and labour mobility, having conducted an enormous portfolio of research into these topics and much more. He's very well known to us at APTC and in fact was one of the architects of our transition from college to coalition. Our next speaker is Miss Andy Fong Toi. So Andy is APTC's Labour Mobility Advisor. Andy brings extensive regional experience encompassing everything from economic governance, trade, private sector, security, political governance, human rights, and good governance to the panel. And she also brings some gender balance, which is great. Our third speaker is Dr. Sunil Kumar, who's a senior lecturer at USP's School of Economics, currently teaching microeconomics and trade, and his specialties are in the area of poverty analysis and national accounting. And our final and fourth speaker is Professor Satish Chand, Professor of Finance, School of Business, University of New South Wales, who's currently based at the Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra. Satish's areas of expertise include aid effectiveness, fiscal fragility, economic growth, international trade, and of course labour mobility. And Satish is in fact a living example of Pacific labour mobility. So perhaps at the end of his presentation we can all make a collective judgment as to whether he's a brain drain or whether in fact he's part of the Pacific diaspora that are actually continuing to contribute to the development of the region. So just one more housekeeping point before we get started. I know as you're going to listen to these presentations, you're going to be thinking about your questions and your comments. And I just ask now if you could really, if you've already made points or had your piece, if you would perhaps hold back and allow some other voices to be heard, because I know we've had a few days of discussions on similar topics. So we'd really like to hear from people who haven't spoke before or issues that perhaps haven't been raised yet. And of course, in crafting your comments or your questions, to keep them as brief as possible so that we can get as much in. Okay, so each of our speakers have 15 minutes, so we might get started, and I'll invite Richard Curtin up to speak.
Thank you very much, Solly. The topic I'm going to present on today has nothing to do with seasonal worker arrangements. This is an area that I first became interested in when we were living in Timor-Leste for 18 months, and I'd been working on youth issues, youth employment issues, and I became aware of the barriers that Australia presented to employers in Timor-Leste, Australian employers, in trying to get their workers into Australia to get work experience. And it became clear to me that one of the obvious ways that employment arrangements or employment opportunities could be provided for Timorese young people was there available in Australia, if only we could work out how the immigration system works. So I had the opportunity over various projects over the years, including the evaluation of APTC in 2014, and then a project for the World Bank, which I did in association with the Development Policy Centre, looking at the detailed understanding and available data of how the skills-based migration system works in Australia and in New Zealand. So I'm drawing on that background for this presentation. The immediate focus is on APTC's new mandate to provide graduates with support to help them to migrate for work. And it's important to realise that graduates view the APTC qualification as a significant opportunity for them to be able to work in Australia. The difficulty is they are not aware that it also requires a number of other obstacles that they've got to overcome to be able to realise the value of that qualification. And in particular, the importance of getting an offer from an employer if you're going in through the temporary skills migration pathway, which I'll explain is the most common way people establish a migration pathway into Australia. So the key principles that I'm trying to focus on in the way labour mobility is shaped is that it's basically a very different relationship than the traditional donor-recipient relationship through an aid program. In the case of labour mobility, both receiving and sending countries only shape the requirements. They're not in the driving seat. Governments cannot control whether employers offer jobs and who takes up the jobs. And I think much more needs to be done to monitor the responses of employers and to work out in particular the occupations that are involved and the impact that this is having on the sending and receiving countries. So why would Australian employers be interested in APTC graduates? There are 4 factors that I can identify. One is that to qualify for the APTC, you have to have prior work experience. And in the case of people who are doing an APTC trade-based top-up course, they have to have basically the equivalent of a trade qualification from their home country, or as it's couched in terms of 5 years work experience. Also, they're getting a recognised Australian qualification. They're getting training delivered by a well-resourced training provider, which means they can come and have a look at the facility and realise that whatever images they have about specific training arrangements would be upset or upturned by having a look at the very well-resourced facilities that APTC has. And that basically the competencies of graduates are assessed by under an audit system that's overseen by Queensland TAFE, because APTC operates under auspices of the Queensland TAFE system, Technical and Further Education. Nevertheless, over the years, the evidence that we've been able to produce shows that relatively very few APTC graduates have migrated. The latest APTC annual report that refers to the period at the end of stage 2, before the beginning of current stage 3, is that of the 12,000 APTC graduates, only 290 or 2.4% are recorded as having migrated overseas. Now, that's an attempt to follow up links through Facebook, etc., to pick up on people overseas. It may be that it is an undercount. I was talking to an employer in the garment industry yesterday who said of the 20 people that had gone through APTC from his company, 3 or 4 had migrated overseas. So that's a higher ratio. But nevertheless, we can be fairly certain that it's a relatively small proportion. And it's very interesting to see where they have been located. 103 were resident in New Zealand, mainly from Samoa and Fiji. And only 76 APTC graduates were recorded as resident in Australia, mainly from Fiji and Vanuatu. Now, with stage 3, as I said, there's a more explicit mandate to offer support to APTC graduates to enable them to migrate. But there was a need to confront the significant risk that employers had emphasised when APTC was first set up, and continue to emphasise, is that here were their skilled workers leaving to go and get a top-up qualification, which would immediately make them much more attractive to employers in Australia. And yet they were expecting that those employees would come back to them. So the solution that we came up with, building on a suggestion that had been made by Michael Clements of the Global Development Centre, that we should separate students into 2 tracks. One that only focused on those who had a commitment from an employer to take them back after their training. Either the employer was sponsoring them or the student gained a bursary from the APTC, that they should go into a home track. And then those who didn't have a commitment to an employer and more explicitly wanted to migrate should go into an away track and be supported to gain additional information about how to do that and hopefully be connected with employers. However, this change to APTC operations, as I found out, is still to be implemented and is due to be implemented in the first semester of 2020. But it's important to acknowledge that because of the APTC's Australian qualification, students, as we found out in the evaluation and follow-up work for the redesign, and I've found out just recently with looking at the end of course surveys, have a very high, most students, 9 out of 10, say that they intend to use the qualification to migrate for work overseas. So that expectation is there and it's high. It varies a little bit by courses, but it's within that range of 85 to 95%. So I've identified two potential pathways that APTC graduates can take. One is for skilled workers, basically those that have a trade-based qualification or experience that's seen as equivalent to that before going into the APTC trade-based qualification, that they in fact are still eligible to migrate to Australia under the new temporary skilled migration skilled shortage visa, which is now called Visa 482, and in fact that visa has been split into those that can go in on a temporary basis on a 2+2 year basis, and those that can go in on a 2+2 basis but still have access to a permanent residence pathway. And those with a trade-based qualification have access to the latter pathway. So probably about 40 to 45% of APTC graduates potentially have access to that pathway. The other now, a pathway that's become available for other APTC graduates in particular, is through the Pacific Labour Scheme, where the focus is on skill level 4 jobs, which are those jobs that previously were not eligible under the skills-based migration entry system. Skill level 4 jobs are basically those that have a post-school qualification, such as requirements such as tourism and hospitality workers, such as aged care workers. And then other jobs within scope under the Pacific Labour Scheme are skill level 3 and at skill level 5. So we're hearing accounts of workers who are being recruited as cooks, who are regarded with an APTC qualification plus a background work experience as a cook, would qualify as for employment at a skill level 3 occupation. So they could also go in under a temporary skilled visa, but that occupation I'll have to check whether that would still be eligible for a permanent residence pathway. But nevertheless, they've got the other option when they're at skill level 3. The important point to realise about the migration system into Australia is that employers are very keen to work out how they can assess people before they offer them the next level up in the position that they can offer. So in many cases, employers try those who are already in Australia to see whether they would be suitable employees. So often the difficulty is that for people applying from the Pacific is that employers have already access to migrants who are in Australia able to work because they've got legal work rights. And there's a large number of people that are there because either they're working holiday makers, they're there because they're the partners of skilled worker visas the partners have an entitlement to work in Australia, but not according to a skill level. And there are New Zealanders who migrate into Australia, and I think the number who say they're coming for short or long-term employment is about 30,000 a year. And then there are others such as TAFE graduates who are entitled in a relevant occupation to 18 months employment as a graduate work visa. So that means that there are many people, migrants already in the country that employers often turn to. If we look at the figures over time of the skill level 3 occupation, which is the one that Pacific migrants are most likely to be able to access, we can see over time that in fact there is a significant decline in the number. I'm not too sure why that is, partly to do with the decline in the mining industry, and it's probably partly to do with recent changes which have tightened up on various occupations such as cooks, which was the major occupation that I think it still is. So if we're recruiting at skill level 3 from offshore, that is from outside the country, then it narrows down the number of jobs that are available. Only 71% of employers in 2017-18 recruited skill level jobs from overseas. Whereas with skill level 1 jobs, which are the professional jobs, they less than half recruited workers from overseas. So the way in which professional workers are able to get into Australia, either through various means and then get recruited locally is, 71% are recruited from within Australia, but in the case of skill level 1 workers, only less than 50% were recruited from at the professional level. So employers were more willing to recruit professionals from overseas because they looked to the professional's qualification as a clear signal that the person was able to do the job. Now here are the list of occupations that are available for those who were recruited from offshore. So we can see in yellow those occupations that APTC offer qualifications in. So motor mechanic and cook and diesel motor mechanic are at the top, followed by metal fabricator, fitter, painting trades worker, carpenter, and metal machinist. We're just moving through quickly. These are the results of a graduate tracer survey that applies not to the most recent round, to the previous round, but here we see that there are significant proportions of people at the time that the survey was carried out who, with APTC graduates, who were not in employment. So in fact, 42% of those with commercial cooking qualification were not employed, 24% with carpentry and 19% in engineering and fabrication trade. So this shows that there's a danger of overtraining for occupations in a relatively small labour market and how important it is to have a labour mobility option. If we look at Fiji graduates for the same period, we see again significant proportions that are not employed, and in the case of aged care workers, clearly the local labour market's not large enough. These exclude existing employees, so people who are not going back into employment. The local labour market's not large enough to be able to support aged care graduates. So basically there is a need to skill up workers to be able to cope with small labour markets where there can be an overshoot for demand. So the final conclusion here is that basically there is a need for a great attention to looking at the balance and imbalance within domestic labour markets and how to work out that responses to out-migration opportunities may also create those imbalances. And I highlight a problem with the Samoan quota where there's no information collected in Samoa on the occupations of those people who are leaving every year. The side agreement labour mobility arrangement, which is a side agreement to PACER Plus, highlights the need to strengthen collection and harmonisation of labour statistics in the developing countries, and I think that is a process that still needs to be further reinforced. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, for taking us through some of the options that APTC graduates have to take up employment in Australia, and also looking at some of the ways APTC is changing to meet both our domestic labour market needs here in the region, but also in Australia and New Zealand as well. So maybe I'll just invite everyone again to thank Richard for his presentation. And a very nice segue onto our next presenter, Andy Fong Toi.
Start very well. Thank you, Solly and Richard. And as Solly said, thank you, Richard, in particular, because that's a very nice segue into what I want to focus on. Okay. So I'd just like to begin by providing some context to APC's work on labour mobility. And Richard has provided you with some very good background on the past work we've done, or I suppose you could say haven't done, on labour mobility. But a renewed emphasis on labour mobility is the key strategic shift in stage 3 of APTC. And ensuring a net skills gain is a fundamental engagement principle of our approach to labour mobility. And Australia has provided significant development assistance to help Pacific Island countries reach that. We're being provided with $33.5 million annually to train a potentially mobile Pacific workforce with targeted skills in their own countries. And to date, there have been more than 14,000 Pacific Island graduates, and I'm happy to report that of those graduates, more than 40% have been women, and in particular, we have been emphasising or encouraging women to take up skills in the non-traditional skills. For example, what areas that have been traditionally for males. So, turning now to APTC's work on net skills gain, the question is, what is net skills gain? And for us, there are two separate and critical dimensions. The first is our strategic efforts to ensure increased labour mobility does not result in brain drain. And today we've had references to that. And also, I think if you follow PAC News, there's been some reporting very recently about concerns about brain drain. And brain drain in particular is to ensure that the essential and limited supply of technical and vocational skills in Pacific Island countries are not affected adversely by labour mobility and migration. And so what we've done is we've commissioned an assessment of national and international labour mobility demand in our region to inform, first and foremost, our training profile and course offering. But we do intend to share that work widely so that our TVET national training providers can also be aware of the demand for the employer demand, both in the region and outside the region. And we're doing that work in a collaborative way. We're working with the Pacific governments, employers, TVET providers, and other stakeholders, as I said, to ensure that our workers who migrate don't adversely impact on the stock of workers that we have nationally. And where there are perceived immediate skill shortages, we will work with employers to identify replacements and facilitate top-up training. The second is our strategic efforts to ensure that there's actual brain gain. And this has two elements. The first is by way of increased domestic skills because of spillover effects from enhanced international standard training in country. And the second is by the additional skills that are achieved through medium and longer term impacts of circular migration. And these skills from circular migration can include skills gained through, for example, increased financial capital. And this morning, although the focus was on mainly the seasonal worker program and the RSC, we were shown examples of this increased financial capital. There's also benefits in changes in perceptions and expectations based on the experience of having worked in a different country, and particularly in a developed country. There's increased soft skills, including language, literacy, and numeracy, as well as other employability skills and greater likelihood of self-employment and entrepreneurship and resulting job opportunities for others. I say this, but with the proviso that the Pacific Labour Scheme has only been in place, I think, for a year. And so I think this is an area rich for research, looking forward about specifically the brain gain that can be gained from longer-term circular migration under the Pacific Labour Scheme. The increased quality of TVET will also increase the value of TVET, which in turn supports economic development. And the focus must shift from the prioritisation in many of our countries of an academic pathway for individuals to a skills pathway. Government and educational institutes from primary to high school and then to post-secondary need to support a model that is inclusive of skills development and value that skills development is fundamental to mobility, gains for communities and growth for the country. Although we have had the debate this morning about whether labour mobility actually impacts on GDP and whether it's really about addressing poverty, which I think in itself is a noble intention. So what I'd like to talk about in a few minutes is what we're doing in terms of collaborating for net skills gain. And Richard's already talked about this dual approach track to training. And let me say at the outset, APTC is a regional example of a global skills partnership. And I don't know with Satish whether you'll talk about the GSP. He's nodding, so he will. Okay. So our dual track approach is intended to meet, as I said, both the domestic and the labour mobility skill needs within our overall training profile. And as improved labour market information is determined and demand is identified, a range of full qualifications and accredited skill sets will be delivered by either APTC or our partner Pacific Training Institutes via individually or via our partnership arrangements. And it is very much our intention that we will respond to country and regional Pacific labour markets. We will, of course, provide training broadly determined by employment opportunities in Australia, New Zealand, and beyond. And in particular, we'll work especially closely with the Pacific Labour Facility in the first instance to ensure that the qualifications we deliver are aligned with the industry sectors and qualification levels required by Australian employers. And Richard's talked about the skilled visa, but of course, there's the Pacific Labour Scheme, which I think is going to open up this opportunity for labour mobility for low and semi-skilled workers in Australia. But I'd also like to say that we are conscious that there are intra-regional labour mobility opportunities as well. And again, this morning we heard about the bilateral opportunities that some countries are pursuing, and that's on our radar. So students who indicate an interest in labour mobility will be provided, this is the way track or the labour mobility track, they'll be provided with an additional customised labour mobility short course. And this will include elements such as information about different temporary and circular migration pathway options, additional support for English language proficiency, cultural orientation for life outside their home country, employability and interview skills, work health and safety, first aid, and additional financial literacy skills. And our hope is that as Australia and New Zealand employers seek labour, that we will work through the PLF, MFAT, and government labour mobility sending units to link them with specific APTC graduates with the relevant skills. We will also support our past graduates, and we've done this, particularly in the aged care, where we provided them with refresher training. In terms of support to improve quality of Pacific TVET delivery, there is research that increased labour mobility can play a catalytic role in improving the quality of TVET in the Pacific. And as international labour mobility opportunities, including the Pacific Labour Scheme, expand, this should provide additional incentive to improve the standards of training and services available locally. This could also result in an increased domestic take-up of TVET education as these institutions demonstrate high standings, and including by people who either have no intention of migrating or do start with intention of migrating and then don't for whatever reason. And there's also a spillover effect on the higher skills required for trainers, which in itself is a skills gain for the region's trainers. And so we will work with local partners and existing regional, national, and national training institutions to support their improved delivery of TVET. And this will include investing in the professional development of trainers, professional exchanges, and rotating of short-term inputs from external trainers to address technical deficits in training institutions. We are already supporting key regional initiatives aimed at improving the quality of TVET and the mutual recognition of skills, qualification, and competencies. And I refer in particular to the SBC's Education and Quality Assessment Program and the Pacific Regional Education Framework. And a specific example of this is our agreement between the APTC, the Fiji National University, and the Fiji Higher Education Commission, and the Construction Industry Council in Fiji, where we're helping to standardise national qualifications in carpentry. And Rich has also, I think, referred to, there's also potential for government-to-government relationships to provide additional investments in skills development in the Pacific through free trade agreements, and Richard referred to the PACER Plus, the standalone labour mobility agreement under the PACER Plus. There's also teacher exchanges. For example, Fiji, retired teachers are working in Tuvalu and Marshall Islands. There's also examples of private sector programs whereby overseas employers finance pre-migration skills for new hires, and the Kiribati Marine Training Centre, supported by German shipping companies, is an example in our region. And the prospect of skilled and semi-skilled migration can also increase an individual's own investment in education. And I know there has been, Satish, I think, did you write this paper on the impact of the coups in Fiji and citizens' investment in education? Donor-funded infrastructure could also include contractual obligations for skill transfers to national workers, and they're best practice examples from Australia. And the Australia Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific is an opportunity to support target investments in skills development. And I just read this morning also that apparently the IFC is intending to provide quite a lot of funds for homes, affordable homes, in Port Moresby, and I think that's another example of, APTC and national TVET institutions in Papua New Guinea upskilling people in construction. And finally, I'd just like to speak briefly about the importance of investing in workers while they're away and on return. And so employers could support the upskilling of workers with on-the-job training while they're away, and this is occurring, for example, already in the Hayman Islands. And there's also potential to support returnees to apply knowledge gained while away, while they're away, and to use this knowledge when they return. And this could include capturing the skills to address the local labour market. One of the one of the potential areas that everybody's very much excited about is the aged care market. But as Richard showed on his graph, there's not many opportunities at the moment for aged care workers. But anecdotally, I'm hearing about the need for Pacific, for this service in the Pacific. And I think a couple of weeks ago in the Fiji dailies, there were references to the long waiting list for aged care, for beds in aged care facilities. So this is, you know, a potential area when we get our returned aged care workers, you know, and bearing in mind that the Pacific Labour Scheme is 3 years. So, okay, we've got about three to 4 years to start thinking about this area. So APTC is also looking at designing a returning workers offer, which may include career guidance, RPL for Australian qualifications with gap training, small business training, and life skills such as managing finances. And there's also the potential, while our workers are overseas, for us to think about helping them while they're there, think about what they can do when they come back. And there are models, particularly in Europe, about assisting these workers. So in my last few minutes, I'd just like to talk about engaging with the broader Pacific Skills Policy framework. And already, again, this morning there was discussion about policies or mechanisms to manage labour mobility, and the suggestion, for example, that you have a pool and it's only for unemployed workers. I think what we need to, and there was a reference to needing to be consistent with those workers' human rights. So I think skilled workers need a range of choices for employment opportunities and meaningful livelihoods. But to minimise, at the same time, while trying to minimise TVET skill losses, we need to respect individual choices. And so APTC is working with our partners to look at new and practical approaches to strengthening the skills, jobs, and growth across the region. And what I'd like to refer to is the Pacific Skills Partnership, which was launched by the President of Nauru at the 43rd Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Meeting, which brought together individuals, organisations and institutions who recognise the vital link between skills and sustainable development to the region and are committed to scaling up efforts and investment needed to secure skills for a sustainable and inclusive future. And one of the 3 commitments under this partnership, the Pacific Skills Summit, was held at this institution only last week. Okay, I'm going to finish right now. And of particular relevance to this session is that the summit recognised the anticipated benefits that current investments on labour mobility initiatives with New Zealand and Australia will bring to the region. It further recognised that there exist opportunities to support labour mobility opportunities amongst Pacific countries themselves, which I refer to. And there was a call to explore new policy spaces to accelerate circular skill migration across our region beyond existing trade arrangements. And through its partners, the Pacific Skills Partnership will raise these matters at the Pacific Labour Mobility Annual Meeting, and in particular we were asked to raise the possibility of a Pacific Skills Visa to support interregional mobility, as well as the critical work to provide widely recognised standards and qualifications that allow mobility and portability. And just my final comment is that the Pacific Skills Partnership will continue this momentum created by the summit, and at the next leaders meeting in August in Funafuti, we are hoping to launch a Pacific Skills portal which will address the data gaps and share labour market information. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks so much, Andy, for that wonderful presentation on all the things we're doing at APTC to try and ensure a net skill gain for Pacific economies, and also exploring some of those ideas around what incentives labour mobility might have to actually improve TVET systems here in the Pacific. So I just ask you to thank Andy again. And I now invite our third speaker, Dr. Sunil.
Thank you, Soli. And good afternoon, everyone. My presentation this afternoon is basically on Fiji. This is a paper we are trying to develop between myself and Sothia Om. Sothia is not here this afternoon. And also I would want to add that there's no CG modeling in this one, as I had suggested initially. For the reason we are still adjusting our CG model, and we didn't want to report anything that wasn't so sound. Okay, my line of presentation, I would have a brief introduction, then I would look at labor market overviews, wage rates, labor productivity, and so on, migration, and sector constraints, and so on, and concluding remarks. The characteristics of Fiji's labor market. First of all, it is a small labor market compared to globally and compared to Australia, of course, and New Zealand. And for that reason, there are many constraints in terms of the demand side as well as the supply side. There's huge skill shortage, okay, in Fiji for many reasons, and for the key one, that there's huge migration. Skilled migration has been taking place for the last 30 or so years. And the most qualified and the most experienced people have basically migrated. And in the workplace, the experienced workers are basically missing. You always find that in the workplace, there won't be people who can guide the younger, the inexperienced people into the job. Outward migration and immigration policies. Outward migration, as I have said, low productivity is a perennial problem in every sector. And as I go on, I'll show some bits of it through data. And low wage rates. And low wage rates is one key factor why workers from Fiji are actually leaving. They're finding better jobs, better paid jobs, of course, in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. And I think the main problem is outward migration. A lot of people say it's not a problem, but for developing countries, as an economist, I feel that it's a huge problem for a country like Fiji, and Fiji in particular, where there has been, political instability and there have been, social issues, whatever you may say. People have migrated, particularly qualified ones. In Fiji, in terms of getting people from abroad, now industries are feeling the crunch, and I think there's a lot of demand for people coming from out into Fiji to work, particularly in construction sector and other kinds of technical work. We are looking towards like Philippines, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and so on. Okay, the size of the labor market, I've said it's small, 0.38 million. According to available bank data, Fiji's labor force grew very slowly, 1.26% a year from 1990s to 2017. Key reason for this was high number of immigrants during the years. All bank data shows that since Fiji's independence, since 1970, the net migration rate has been negative, and per thousand data is showing here highs of minus 18, 19 for 90s. That's after the 1987 coup, I guess. Minus 10.7 in 2000. It increased again after the coup in 2000 to 15.1 up to 2005. And I think it has slowed down now. I would love to see it go zero. The National Strategic Human Resource Plan for 2011-15 identified continuing migration of skilled and experienced professionals as a key reason for the skills gap. I think we have enough universities, we have enough training facilities. Perhaps not focused, but they're there. For the technical trades, blue-collar jobs, the shortage arises from the perception that These jobs are of lower stature and are less well paid compared with white-collar professions. This is what is being said in a Fiji National Productivity Plan. The report came out recently, and I have drawn a lot of data from this particular document. This is exacerbated by the unfavorable perception of the technical and vocational training, education and training, TVET, compared with higher education. Everybody wants to go to universities. TVETs rank lower in their perception. As a result, enterprises have to depend on workers from other countries. Of recent, we have seen that actually happening. Besides work attitudes, there are lots of work attitudes and behaviors. The skills of workers, both generic and functional, fall short of employers' expectations. Fiji's National Strategic Human Resource Plan for 2011-15 concluded that survey after survey of employees in Fiji point to lack of practical experience of new employees as the biggest labor market problem they face. So basic skills are missing. And a study was done in 2013 by FNU, Fiji National University, to figure out where the problems were, and it pointed out exactly what I have just said. Basic things are missing, basic skills are missing, fundamentals are not there, which I think questions the kind of curriculum, the kind of training we have in primary and high schools. So those are the kind of things we have to address. Strategies must be adopted, a holistic approach to manage the proximate factors. Enterprises, economic sectors, and economic structure, all these need attention, and enablers, business and macro enabling institutions, like labor institutions and so on, including unions, I would guess. Only by such approach that capital deepening is a key point here. As I move on, I'll show that this is a fundamental problem. It's not happening the way, even the sectors that are expanding, capital deepening and technology, appropriate adoption of appropriate technology is not happening. So that's the problem. And that is why productivity remains low. It's not increasing. What I showed yesterday, that the growth rate in Fiji is not as it is being proclaimed. It's much less. So, and the main issue is productivity of the resources, the workers, particularly. All right, so this will then support if that approach is taken, then the GDP growth of 4 to 5% a year in the plan, 20-year plan, could actually be realized. What is critical is the agility of foreseeing future trends that impact all the drivers of national productivity and quickly adapting and seizing opportunities to improve the drivers. So this is where the question is pointing towards the policymakers, those experts who are out there. I presume there are some experts working on this with the government. All right, let's look at the structural economic transformation. Look at Fiji's agricultural sector. It's going down, yeah? But in the case of upper middle countries, it's the same, no big deal. Industry also going down. Manufacturing that has been separated somehow, it's gone down quite significantly, which may not be the case for middle income countries. That transition is not happening as a natural process of economic progress. There are fundamental structural problems arising. That is why it's happening that way. And of course, policy failure. Services has expanded more than expected. And for that reason, I think there are some fundamental problems, like adoption of new technologies, new ideas, and so on. And again, I will talk about government policies. We need to disaggregate these sectors further to examine exactly where the problems are. That is what we would need to do. That's what the experts need to do, to find out exactly what is happening and what needs to be done to expand value addition in each productive sector. Okay, so in the case of agriculture, for instance, I have serious problems with this. While the agriculture sector remains at about 11%, there is not much happening. I think Fiji is located in such a place where we can capitalize on agricultural sector in terms of value addition and so on. We have excellent, soil out here, fertile soil and so on. We still have significant number of people engaged in farming. We can capitalize on that. So I would assume that the government needs to do more to sustain that level, or in fact expand the agricultural sector in terms of proportion of contribution toward GDP. Industry is a troubling one. If you look at industry, in similar countries, it is sticking at about 32.6%. In Fiji, it has come down to 14.6%. This is where the employment and technical skills, the technology is needed. And this is where the structural problem is. So I would stand to say that these sectors need to expand, including manufacturing. Okay? They have just shrunk because the policies are not right. Here, because there's a lot of government components, so it has expanded from 39 to 56, looks okay. But I think this too, like in financial sector, like in ICT and so on, technology hasn't really deepened in. It hasn't really created that amount of value. ICT on its own has, but ICT hasn't entered health sector. ICT really hasn't entered into education sector. That's the problem. So productivity has remained low. I will run through this now. Okay, and the amount of employment that is generated through this is also questionable. And the first one, the agriculture, is the one where we would want to see. You see, for Fiji, the contribution of that sector is at 11%, but the employment is 39.2%, which is huge, which points to the fact that productivity in agriculture is very low. I'll leave the others. This is some data, comparative data. Fiji's productivity in comparison to Asian Productivity Organization's membership of 20, similar economies, I guess, has remained above. And Fiji's productivity, I guess, is falling now. That's troubling. And labor productivity, you can see. All right? This data is an interesting one. If you look here for 1995, 2000, and 2010 to 16, kind of similar. In a similar economy like Mauritius, from 2005 to 2018, productivity has been quite high, which is at about 3. So this is where our losses are, productivity growth in different sectors. You can see in agriculture it has remained low. That's the problem. Okay, I don't have to read through this. The plan is to take the economy up here. If we look at the present trend, it is targeting at this point. When we talk about labor productivity, it is about GDP per capita, all right? So if we are looking at this point, which means we have to work really hard, we have to train our people, I guess APTC is contributing, but it can contribute much more, and it has to be focused on the domestic economy, not about migration. I have some troubles with that. All right, so I'll skip through. I think I have I have said enough. This is just data on employment. All right, so these are the areas where the problems are. We don't even find qualified plumbers. We don't even find qualified electricians to come and fix our problems. Basic kind of work in kind of household fixing. If there are technical issues, we might have to import some from Australia or US or somewhere. That's how bad it is. Okay, I'll just skip through for the time. Migration and labor mobility. Migration must be discouraged. Long-term policy prescription is needed or are needed. Policies are needed. Australia and New Zealand labor mobility policies do not augur well for Fiji. It may do for other Pacific Island countries. For us, for instance, when a worker leaves Fiji as a qualified, say technical worker, goes to New Zealand, Australia will never want to come back. Even if he or she comes back, would not want to work in the industries. The demand for wages kind of wedges up. So that's the problem. So we also need policies for reforms. I think the government would be dumbfounded if it doesn't pay heed. I think it has to draw in lots of experts like Satish and others in the region to work on this. And appropriate education and training policies are needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar, and I'm very sorry to cut you off because I think for anyone who was with us last week at the Skills Summit, a huge amount of those issues came out very, very strongly, and particularly this idea around the Pacific needing that agility to be able to foresee some of the future trends, adopt new technologies and innovations, and certainly transform our training systems to be able to support future needs. So I'm very sorry to have cut you off, but we are running a little bit out of time. And now I hope we finally, in our last speaker, Satish, who will come and talk to us about all the opportunities that migration might actually have for brain circulation, particularly within the Pacific Island Forum, and how best we might prepare the islands for these gains. Satish.
Thanks, Soli. I should know a little bit about skilled migration. Look, while this is being sorted out, it was loaded, so we don't know what happened. We probably lost it. What happened? We can load it. Oh, sorry about that. There you are. Okay. While this is being loaded, go ahead. Sorry, I'm crowding you out. So maybe we'll wait until this is loaded. Sorry. You're not on the right track. Yeah. Yes, that's the one. Thank you. Okay, let's go back. Thank you so much. The first, let me just make a few observations. Again, a pleasure being here. It's always good to be here. For those of you who don't know, I teach at the University of New South Wales in Canberra, but I'm originally out of Fiji, and I taught at this university some 30 years ago. The first thing I would make, the first observation I would make is that migration is a fact of life, and we have to embrace it regardless of what we say. It is just part of life. But then the bigger point is that there is what is called a skill premium. So the premium you get as a skilled worker is much larger than that for an unskilled worker. Let me be very specific. You can be an unskilled worker in Australia, New Zealand, US. Ben Graham, are you around here somewhere? Ben, okay, Ben is there. Ben would sort of would explain this in much more detail. You can be an unskilled worker in a rich country and you would be living around the poverty line. The reason why you do well as unskilled worker on the RSC or the seasonal worker program is because of the high minimum wages abroad, and only if you can bring the savings back home. But if you are a skilled worker, regardless of where you are in the world, even if you are in another poor country, there's a premium you earn which is well above the unskilled wages. Let me give you a very specific example. If you were a registered nurse in Fiji, the average, anybody who's a registered nurse over here? No? The average wage of a registered nurse in Fiji, and I'm going to use Fiji as an example, is $27,000 average. Does anyone know what the average wage of a nurse is in Australia? Fijian dollars? 70? 60? It's about $100,000. So you could quadruple your income by flying 3 hours. Okay? The cost of training a nurse in Fiji is roughly a third of what it costs in Australia. Let me be specific. Nursing takes about 3 years, costs you roughly $9,000 a year, it's about 27 grand. The same training in Australia will cost you $20,000 per year, which is about $60,000. 60,000 Aussie dollars, that's close to 90,000 Fijian dollars. So it's about 3 times. So the question is, if you can produce a nurse at 1/3 the cost and get income for that nurse at 4 times what you get over here, right? It's a factor of 12. Why doesn't that happen? The reasons are very simple. The first reason is that nurses are not like kava or apples or whatever you can think of. They don't sort of chase the highest dollar. People do move, people move back, but income is part of the explanation. So that's one. The other explanations are more economic in nature. There are impediments at source, issues like brain drain that Sunil talked about, and that has been a big impediment. Also, at destination, there are people who try and stop this on arguments of brain drain. This has been a big issue regarding medical professionals and particularly doctors. There are also impediments at destination, and these impediments are in the form of recognition of skills. So if you're a nurse over here, to get recognized in Australia, you have to either go through a training school that has that recognition, it's accredited in Australia, or you have to go and sit additional exams. Sometimes you are required work experience. And often in the case of Australia, if you want to meet the minimum points for migration, you need to have Australian experience, which you can't have until and unless you get into Australia, right? So it basically feeds off itself. Now, the final, and we need to keep these issues separate, the final impediment is funding. In some cases, many of our kids don't have the money to go to university to begin with. The other problems are quite a few of them are funded through scholarships. And once they come out and study on scholarships, given that the taxpayer has funded their studies, they can't escape. That's quite fair. Okay? So these are the issues that hold them back, and I want to go through each one of them separately. Skills, recognition, issues of funding, and issue of brain drain. Brain drain seems to be the biggest issue that Sunil raised, so I'm going to talk about that. I came here, I have a paper on this. I came here at the invitation of Soli and the APTC, and I started thinking pretty hard about these issues. So I'm going to borrow on Soli's focus questions. Why should the region as a whole work together to address labor market challenges? How can the Pacific capitalize on the prospect of demographic dividend? And I'll talk about that in a minute. And the last one, what have we learned to date on net skills gain? So Andy mentioned that very briefly. A big complaint of last week when we were having this summit was the mismatch of supply and demand for skills. So what is being supplied is very different to what is in demand in the marketplace, and we always struggle with that. Now, that would be an ongoing challenge because the world, the markets are changing so rapidly. But there are 4 forces of change which will remain with us. The first force of change, and I call this the cornerstones, are the demographic change. The population around the Asia Pacific region is aging fairly rapidly. Japan in particular, South Korea, they're aging. So they have a problem of shortage of young people. We in the Pacific Islands have an excess supply of young people, right? And we are so small in terms of population size, and we are relatively poor compared to the folks around us who need workers. Our challenge is in transforming the raw material that we already have into productive workers who could earn a lot of money. Where they earn is immaterial. You are no less a Fijian if you work in Japan vis-a-vis remaining in Ba, which is where I come from. Okay, so that's the first one. Technology. It's changing so rapidly that it is believed that 65% of the jobs we have around now won't be there in 20 years' time. So you will always have this mismatch, but we want to prepare our workers who are agile and adaptable. That goes back to our education system. And now you literally don't have to move to provide many of those services. You can telecommute. I was talking to the chairman of ANZ Bank over here, where they supply so many services to the rest of ANZ branches from Suva. You literally don't have to go there. The third one is climate change, which is forcing some mobility on the people. That I think we have to remember, given in the Pacific Islands, this is the region which is going to be affected the most. And the last one I've already talked about. There is a skill premium, and it's not going away soon. Now, Andy said I was going to talk about the Global Skills Partnership. So this is part of a compact on migration signed by 160 countries or so out of 190. Australia did not sign, and neither did US. But this is what it talks about. It talks about skill creation through migration. So you try and increase the pool of skilled workers by using migration. So the way it works is you have a destination country, let's say Australia. You have an origin country, let's say Fiji. Australia provides funding for the training of Fijians for their market, but by doing so, they also increase the pool of skilled workers in Fiji. So in here, as Richard was saying, again very briefly, you have two tracks, a home track and an away track. People who are on the home track get trained similarly to those who are on the away track, except that those on the away track are trained or given additional training, language, let's say, being able to assimilate in the new environment. And these are the guys who get then, who get to go abroad. Now, the people on the away track, obviously it assumes that you know where we want to go, but there may be the folks who can also come back. So you could have this circulation from destination to source. And the beauty about GSP, the Global Skills Partnership, is that it is a win for the destination, it is a win for the origin country, it is a win for those individuals who are on the home track, and it is a win for those who go away. So it's a win, 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 win. Then you have no arguments for brain drain, you have no arguments about the pool of skilled workers being depleted. Now, I'll skip this slide. Oh, before I go there, just the last question. This question has been raised several times. You know, if we do open up to skilled migration, everybody will leave. The evidence is quite the opposite to that. In fact, there are many countries on the planet who have free mobility into rich country markets. Cook Islands is an example. All of our northern Pacific states who have access to the US market. There's research done by John Gibson and David McKenzie who look at the top performers out of Papua New Guinea, Tonga, New Zealand, and Samoa, I think. And they trace these people. Where have they gone? And it shows very clearly that for these people, they go out to work, but the majority of them come back and stay home. For reasons other than income, they know fully well the losses they're making, but there's still this attachment to home. Now, what do we have to do to try and capitalize on the skill premium that is being offered to us by the Pacific region? The first thing we have to do, and this is quite disturbing for the Pacific Islands, is our deteriorating quality of primary education. So all of the statistics I have looked at so far from the Pacific Island Literacy and Numeracy Assessment shows that the quality of numeracy and literacy within our primary schools has been going backwards. And that is shocking because we're spending more per candidate, we're having better teachers, we're having better schools. I grew up in Fiji where we had thatched classrooms. So all of our inputs have gone up, but for some reason or the other, the schooling system is producing output that has gone backwards. We've got to look at that pretty closely. Because if we are to produce these agile workers who would be able to adjust to a changing global environment, we need to have those skills. I think the next one is the recognition and portability of skills. All of this morning and bulk of last week was all about bilateral arrangements. So migration from Fiji to Australia or Vanuatu to New Zealand, these are all bilateral arrangements. If you do for all of our Pacific Forum members, there are 16 of them. If you did all of this bilaterally, if you know your maths, the combinatorics, that's about 120 bilateral arrangements. And you're going to get tangled in between those. It's not that there's only a shortage of workers in Australia or New Zealand. There are nurses who work in the Republic of Marshall Islands from Fiji. There are teachers who work there. There's so many of our hospitality workers who work in Cook Islands. I think we have to think as a region where we create an integrated labor market, because there never will be a case where any one small country will be able to meet all of its needs domestically. I think we have to think a bit broader than that. I have a paper on this. If anybody wants it, you can. I'm happy to email it to you. But I have been arguing for what I call a Pacific Skills Visa. The Caribbean community has that. Now, on work experience for international mobility, as I say, Pacific Skills Visa will help that. How about funding? Remember I said funding was a big issue? The biggest beneficiaries of tertiary education are the individuals themselves. And I'm suggesting that we need to rethink and relook at a loan scheme where we give a pot of money, people take loan out of that money, get educated, repay that loan, so the pot never depletes and we just keep producing more and more skilled workers. Okay? We're going to never run out of that money. At the moment with scholarships, we will always run out. And if you have studied on a loan, I really don't care where you go because you studied on a loan. You don't owe the taxpayer anything. All you need to do is repay the loan. And finally, within the region as a whole, we have got very poor resource planning, human resource planning. So Sunil's point that we have these shortages and excess supply in one skill and shortages in the other is evidence that we have not got good planning, good human resource planning, something to be looked at. Let me finish off. I think the Pacific Skills Partnership that was talked about much last week can evolve into a highly efficient regional skills partnership. What have we learned from IPT so far? Skills recognition is a problem, but that can be fixed. Resourcing and financial viability has been a challenge that can be fixed. And there's opportunities for skill and brain gain. There's so much opportunity for circulation. I don't have the time right now to talk about how we navigate the future, but I have got some thoughts in the paper on that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Satish, and I'm sure everybody will want to read that paper. Now, we've all done a very bad job this afternoon. You were all late coming back from lunch. The timekeepers and I have had a hard time with the panel, who all went over. But I'd like to invite them all, please, to come up and take a seat. I believe afternoon tea will be on soon, so I think we can extend and eat into that time because it's very important that we have some questions from all of you now. So I believe there's some roving mics, so we might take maybe 3 questions and then we'll head to the panel to answer them. So as before, if you make yourself known, tell us what your question is, who it's for, and our panellists will note them down and we'll answer a few at a time. So we've got a couple over this side, one at the front and one at the back.
My name's Tess Newton-Kay and I'm an associate of the Development Policy Centre. I guess my question is for maybe Satish and Andy, but happy to hear from anyone. If we start from the basis that everything that everyone, that this is a good thing and Satish's partnership is the way forward, what are the barriers or what are the political hurdles that need to be cleared here? How do we get our politicians and ministries and people that make decisions at that level to buy into this?
Thank you. We'll take another one up the top.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the panel for such a wonderful presentation. My name is William Tuni. I'm a third-year student here at the university. And first of all, I'd like to apologize for my lack of understanding. I'm still a student. I have much to learn. But my question is directed to Mr. Sunil Kumar and Dr. Satish Chand. So what I actually ask is an opinion, an educated opinion, whether the effects of, whether remittances from abroad can counteract the effects of migration. And I say this in the perspective of seasonal migrant workers, and particularly rugby players who are playing for clubs abroad. Thank you.
Okay, we have one more question over here.
Thank you. My name is Maria from Habitat for Humanity, Fiji. It will be a comment and a question to APTC. I'm a product of APTC, becoming the first female carpenter for Habitat for Humanity, Fiji. And thank you for the great opportunity. I know you have given opportunity to women who in a society where construction is termed as a man's job. But, and I'm glad I went into the institution that allows women to be doing that and men to go into what we term as a woman's job. My question is, we have had majority of the women that I graduated with, I saw myself in the slide, the first slide. So majority of the women we graduated with are working now. And I usually talk with these women that I graduated with, and one of the girls' comment really struck me is that she graduated as a certificate in carpentry, and she's working now. But the thing is, every time she goes to work as a carpenter, she cleans the workplace. She goes in the morning. She is given a broom to clean the place, and that happens after work too. So my question is there a network at at APTC that looks into this, that the skill that they acquire from APTC, the studies, the sacrifices that they have gone through doesn't go to waste because the skills that they acquire is not being in use due to this kind of situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have just one more? All right, we might hand over and we'll let each of the panel respond to those questions. So we might start with you, Satish.
Okay, sure. So the first question was on political hurdles. I think the biggest hurdle, at least in Australia, and it's changing somewhat, were the unions. Because remember, I've been working on this for a few decades. A big problem was convincing the Australian Labor Party, which changed. So on the Australian side, it was unions. It's also the Australian Medical Association with a lot of the skills recognition. There are people who are going to be affected by migrants. But in some areas, and goes back to the political hurdles, there are statistics which show that Australia will be short of 51,000 nurses by 2023. And if you go to Australian hospitals now, you will see nurses from India, from Philippines, from Nepal, from all over the place. So obviously those shortfalls will only grow. So the political hurdles, I think, for specific occupations which are in demand, where supply is lagging, things will change. I think the step up by the Australian government that Stephen was talking about will also help in that regard. On remittances, you asked me what my views were. Remittances is over and above all of those benefits I talked about. So if remittances were zero, all of my arguments go through. If remittances is $1, for Fiji it's $500 million for last year, according to the Reserve Bank that I learned just 2 days ago. Now that's a massive bonus. Also remember, a lot of those remittances go right down to the families. And we know from the literature that a lot of those remittances get invested into education of the next generation. So if those remittances lead to skilling of the children, which then makes them reap the benefits of the skill premium I talked about, that's a huge plus. But everything I said goes through with zero remittances. On the last one, the issue of the Habitat Fiji one, and these are the soft skills that Richard Curtin talked about, right? So maybe you're picking apples, but there are no apples in Fiji to pick. So there's not much you're going to learn out of that. But the soft skills that you bring back, including issues of brain waste. I mean, you may be a highly talented carpenter, but if we are not using the talent of yours as a carpenter, that's wasting a skill. Yeah? That's maybe a reflection of the attitude, the cultural attitude we have at home. It may also be a reflection that we didn't plan our human resource needs well. Now, in my presentation, I talked about the planning bit, but there are also these soft skills that are equally important.
Okay, I'll just respond and just with regard to the question about APTC, and I am sorry to hear that that is happening to your friend. But one of the unfortunate things, and in answer to your question, we do graduate tracer surveys where we follow up on our graduates to ask what's happened. And unfortunately, one of the other things that's coming up is that people who graduate from APTC often go back to the job place and they're getting the same wages. And it's the point you made, Sunil, about low productivity and low wages. And I think that's a structural, as you said, a structural issue within Fiji that must be addressed.
Thank you, Andy. Just on remittances, I think, and you said whether it mitigates the negatives and the rest of migration issue. For sure, yes, and I think Satish has answered that. But apart from the remittances per se, the experiences, the skills that are required out there actually could come back. I had my doubts about it. I have my doubts about it. And it may also apply to rugby, sports. Whether the guys out there who are playing for Canberra or Wellington or whatever, would they want to come and play for a club in Fiji or in the Pacific? That's a hard question, huh? But remittances, for sure, I think it does mitigate the negative aspect of, and it leads to, on a greater front, bigger front, it leads to, when the monies come to the households, leads to, training and schooling and, all that of families. So that's the best part. Thank you.
Nothing else to add? The only thing I would add is also is that last week at the Skills Summit we did have a group of women trainers in non-traditional areas, and they were telling a very similar story to the one you have, that often it's easy to train, but then once you get into the workplace, that's where all the barriers come, and often women then come back and become female trainers in non-traditional areas because it is so hard in the workplace. So we can connect you with some of the groups that are looking at this issue. Do we have any more questions for our panel this afternoon? One up the back. While the microphone's going up the back, there's one right here, I believe.
Okay, mine is really avoid brain drain is impossibility, because Professor Satish has mentioned that we only got resource to pay 1/4 of what other people can pay. 27,000 against 100 is about 4 times. And there's no way in a country in the Pacific can afford to do that. So it will continue to brain drain. But I think there are ways in which we can try and resolve this, and that is have an income threshold different between white collar and blue collar. At the moment, the threshold is all the same. If you get $30,000, if you earn up to $30,000, you pay tax. You don't have to pay tax. If you exceed that, you pay tax. But my suggestion is that the blue collar threshold should be increased and the white collar remain. Why? Because white collar personnel don't migrate. Only the blue collar people migrate. So it makes sense to give incentive for the blue collar. The other factor in Fiji is we have a problem, maybe it is also unique in other Pacific Island countries, and that is the people that we train, or everybody trains, they eat okay. When they retire, they go back to their village, and we lose them. On the other hand, the Hindi-speaking Fijians migrate.
Sir, can I just ask if you have a question? Because we've just got a few more as well. Is there another part to the question?
Okay. My question is that I think we should do something about it to overcome this problem. Okay. And the other thing is that early retirement, I think we should capitalize on the early retirement to do something about people who retire early and get them back on track and get them back on the skill path. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just a comment and then a question. I'm Ben from Marshall Islands, and Satish mentioned a couple of examples. The skill premium, we've really seen it because a lot of our people have migrated to the States and without any skills and often stepped into poverty and then are not be able to make a good life or even send remittances home. So that's definitely a vivid example. We have a U.S. military base right in the Marshall Islands that has thousands of jobs that Marshallese could have filled, but because we don't have the proper good education system and skills, we have a lot of Americans that come in and work there. And so that's another, it's not just a skills premium to go overseas. Sometimes we have opportunities right in our own countries that we don't take advantage of. My question, Satish, is where are some of these proposals in terms like a regional skills visa or a regional loan fund for tertiary studies? Are these something that the forum leaders perhaps might be considering, or what is the avenue to get these forward?
Do we have any other questions this afternoon? Just one down the front.
Thank you. I have a question for the APTC professionals. That is whether you have ever looked at boat building as a skill that needs to be encouraged in Fiji and in the Pacific Islands, considering that a lot of these countries are divided into different islands. And also when it comes to mobility of laborers, when they go for fruit picking, for seasonal employment, is agricultural training in schools of agriculture a priority when you're selecting applicants to go for seasonal migration? And another concern is listening to all these discussions about labor mobility. We seem to be focusing a lot on the Australian labor market and the New Zealand labor market. So I wondered whether there is a possibility of expanding that and looking at other countries where our workforce usually go to for employment, like the United States and Great Britain, where we have the British Army soldiers, etc. Thank you.
Okay, thanks again. We'll just invite our panel to each make some reflections and comments on those questions. We'll start with Richard.
on, is it? The problem of expanding to other labour markets is that they don't offer the same opportunity for people to connect with jobs. The United States doesn't have a skills-based, demand-based skills migrant entry system. There is a special visa, which I think only has vacancies or positions for about 80,000 for highly specialised skills. But apart from that, it's very hard to identify what the demand is and for outside, for people to be able to migrate into the US for skilled work. Other countries, Canada has a skills-based demand-led system, so it's also possible to do it for Canada. And we've heard this morning that there's already example of Solomon Islanders migrating to Canada, and a specific initiative from Canada where they came into the Solomons to recruit workers. The easy aspect about Australia and New Zealand is that they make the data available as to who were recruited to work in what occupations in the last quarter. So it provides an easy indicator of what occupations are in demand now. In many other countries, it's not possible to get access to data like that.
Thank you. Maybe I'll respond to Humphrey. You pointed out the issue of migration and returns on resources and labor specifically, that it is 4 times that of Fiji, and so kind of continue and all that. It's true. The fact is, the theory says once that equalization happens, what we pay to our nurses here kind of increases and matches with Australia, then migration issue will not be there. Then it will be mutual issue, for Australia and Fiji and the rest of the world. So it points to the fact that our GDP needs to grow. We need to have appropriate policies to train people. We need to adopt new technologies to match what is out there in the rest of the world. And that is where we need appropriate, government approach, strategic approach to do those things. Not easy. We need experts. It's not a political thing. It's something to do with economic development, policies and plans that need to be put in place. Thank you.
Just a quick response to the question. No, we don't provide, as far as I know, skills in boat building, but we can have a one-on-one conversation after this about how APTC decides what's on its scope of training.
Quickly, just on brain drain, it's not that people leave simply because they're going to earn more. I was saying to you that there's very hard evidence to suggest that people remain home despite the large differences. There are many people who circulate around. But do a thought experiment. Imagine if all restrictions for travel between Fiji and Australia were lifted out altogether. You think everybody will pack their bags and go? There would be nothing happening in Fiji? My guess is no. The other point I'd make on brain drain is this. We as human beings decide as to what we want to do. Nobody owns anybody else, right? And people would use all their information, all their skills to do the best for them. And that's a good thing. I think that's something that we want people to be able to do. On Ben's point, again, Ben and I have done some work. As I was saying to you earlier on, you can live roughly on the poverty line as an unskilled worker in Fiji or in Marshall Islands, or you could live on the poverty line roughly if you were an unskilled worker in Australia. The beauty is that if you do the unskilled work in Australia and come back home, that's only when you have the savings. Because in Australia, you go out and work in rural regions where accommodation may be subsidized, the high minimum wages, all of that helps you. But otherwise, skill premium is the way to go. Ben, you're saying, how do we progress this? The summit was on last week, and thanks, Solly, for doing that. I was proposing some of these ideas. I'm an academic who sits down in an office and dreams and writes some of these thoughts down. for people to take up and see if it makes sense. Academics produce a lot of work, maybe 9 out of 10, John will agree, have no traction whatsoever, but if we have 1 win out of 10, we're extremely happy. So yes, Pacific Skills Visa, I think thinking everything bilaterally, and as I was saying, there'll be 120 bilateral agreements between Cook Islands and Marshalls, Tuvalu and Fiji. I mean, most of it doesn't make sense at all. I think it's time we thought, and all of these agreements on all of these rules make it even more complicated to travel between these countries. Yeah? So I think we have to think of it regionally, trying to make the labor market a lot more integrated than it currently is. Try and work in Papua New Guinea and see the sort of hurdles you have to go through. If you are an Australian, try and come and work in Fiji and see the sort of hurdles you have to jump. So we ourselves have to sort a lot of these things at home. And I'm suggesting that we should look at it as a region, maybe the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, maybe an issue for the next Pacific Island Forum leaders meeting, because that is the forum that can really push this agenda.
Well, thanks very much. That might be a nice note to leave it on. That will be a discussion that came out of the Skills Summit. It will be discussed at the Pacific Annual Labour Mobility Meeting and potentially even by leaders. Please join me in thanking the panel, and we'll go for afternoon tea.
That's great, Richard. Good, good.
Yeah, where shall I put it on day 3 or?
Out there.